So, what I'll say is that you can't cite too much. Um, but it also kind of depends on the instructor. It's better to oversight than undercite. Oops, what I'm going to tell you about in this class, here's what you can do. All right. And this might not be the case for all classes, so you have to check with your instructor, your teacher, or your professor. But generally, you don't need to cite every sentence if in multiple sentences in a row they all came from the same source. So what that means is that it looks like this. So if you have, oh my gosh, get out of here. So I've got multiple sentences that come from the same source, multiple in a row. So like I've got multiple sentences that are from source one. Um, because they are multiple and they're all paraphrased, so I'm putting them all in my own words, multiple sentences can go right in a row, but you don't have to cite every single time. Just make sure to cite at the very end. Okay? Because once you cite parenthetically like this, and if you don't have an insight or a signal phrase, that tells me that everything after this is going to not be this source. So if you have a couple sentences and then you cite, that means you're telling your reader, like, hey, I just gave you a bunch of information from a source. Now I'm going to do something else. Um, Now, that looks a little different if you're using a quote. Anytime you use a quote, you must immediately cite that quote. So even if it was in the middle of a bunch of paraphrase from the same source, you must cite the quote. All right. So make sure that you're citing that quote even in the midst of the paraphrasing, and then you can continue with the rules about paraphrasing. So, and if you're paraphrasing material and you paraphrase from multiple sources, make sure you denote when you're using different sources. So, what does that look like? It looks like this. So notice how these first two sentences are both from the same source. It's paraphrased, so I'm not using any quotes, but it's information from one of the sources. So I can use the rules that Miss Hain just told me about, like paraphrase, paraphrase. Then once I'm done with that source, then I can put source one. Okay. Then when I start explaining or using my own ideas and words, that's when I don't have to cite. Then notice how I've got a quote, and I immediately cite that quote, and then I continue with paraphrase. But because this paraphrase is because the paraphrase is only one sentence and it goes into another explanation, the yellow part here, that's why I would cite, because the next sentence from like this cyan color into the yellow, I'm going to be done with that part, right? So I'm done with using that source, so I have to cite it, and then I don't have to cite my explanation because that comes from me. You cite the quote whenever you use a quote. So even if it's in the midst of paraphrase, notice how I've got a paraphrase here. I need to use a quote even if it's in, or I need to cite a quote even in the midst of a paraphrase. So citing rules, if you have multiple sources, or excuse me, multiple sentences that are paraphrased or summarized, which means using your own words, you have multiple sentences like that in a row, you don't need to cite every single sentence. But you always need to cite a sentence that has quotes in it, even if it's in the middle of a bunch of sentences with paraphrase.